Do we have the masses from the Founders Room in here now? Is anybody left out? I want to welcome you to the JWW Lectureship weekend. And I heard a great story that the reason this all started was because Jim was retiring and didn't want another fishing pole, so fly reel or anything like that. So Lynn Young was there at the time, so she told the story, and they all made this happen. So this has been happening for a while, and you'll get to see all of the speakers on the board out in the Founders Room. But I would like to invite you to welcome David Booth. And now you could read this whole bio in here by yourself if you wanted to. So I thought maybe I'd make it a little more personal. So David grew up around here from 57 to 73, so he remembers walking through the parks and the neighborhoods and everything, so he has fond memories of this place. And he studied comparative religion at Harvard. Doesn't like to be called doctor because you don't do that when you're coming from Harvard. You're Mr. David Booth. And then he taught at Theology at University of Chicago. No, he did theology at University of Chicago and taught at St. Olaf. And 1985 until his retirement, he retired in 2020. And he's perfect for this lectureship because he is an advocate. He's a champion of social rights, social justice, especially on things like environmental studies and women and gender studies and Western civilizations. He's done a lot of things around that. And I'm really looking forward to his lecture today because it's some of the things that I've studied and I've tried to preach on. You get, 15 minutes in a sermon to just sort of hit this really deep subject. And so he's going to give you a whole lot more on this topic. And I'm excited about that. He's also published lots of scholarly discussions about theology, sexuality, marriage, and justice. And he even published a few pieces right around the time that the Marriage Equality Act went through and trying to explain it to people. But the thing that's most important about the work that David Booth does, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that he is taking the most important issues of our day and age and applying our theology, looking at it theologically, and then trying to figure out how are we as a religious community going to respond. And so I think you're going to find this very, very intriguing. And then tomorrow we will also have more of a lecture, but I'll try to throw some Bible stuff in there in the service to see how it kind of relates. But I know you're going to be fascinated by what David has to say. I've been talking to him on the phone, and he's just fascinating to talk to. So welcome, David Booth.
Thank you, Jackie. My friends, I'm delighted to be here. As Jackie said, I lived in Colorado Springs from 1957 to 1973. My mother lives here to this day. I'm full of nostalgia and admiration for this city and for the people who live here. I especially admire the First Congregational Church. Until my adolescent rebellion, I was a boy making Advent candles in the Founders Room, watching the mystery. I also really admire Reverend Jim White, in whose honor these lectures have been sustained, and I admire the people who got that going. It's a great gift to a community to sustain a lectureship. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm also very nervous. I'm a white man. I'm going to be talking to you about race and gender. I find I'm compelled to try to speak truthfully about race and gender. I'm compelled to try to speak bravely about race and gender. What I have sorted out in my own mind is painful for me to confront and frustrating for me to confront. If I try to explain what I have learned, I will cause offense. and it sorrows me to think that I will cause offense to you. I beg you to trust at least that my will is good, and I beg you to answer me. The program says there will be a workshop, but I'm not expert at guiding workshops. All I'm really expert at is thinking hard about a subject and sharing with you the fruits of what I was thinking about. So I'm going to talk. And I apologize also that I'm going to talk longer than is courteous. I have a text in front of me that will discipline me from talking even longer. I beg you to, in place of a workshop, to think about your questions for me. You may challenge some facts I share. You may challenge the way I interpret those facts. You may ask some further understanding of these facts. There are microphones here, and so in place of a workshop, I invite you to ask me any questions when we're done. Today, my topic is Christian language and racialized experience. As I talk about it, you may doze off, and I will not be offended. Everybody deserves a nap on a Saturday morning, so be at peace. In my home state of Minnesota, the State Department of Human Rights has just issued a damning report about the Minneapolis Police Department. It's been covered in the New York Times, Washington Post, many other places. The report establishes that MPD stops, searches, arrests, uses force against, and kills people of color, especially black people, at starkly higher rates than white people. The report also documents a litany of vile, racist, and misogynistic slurs made by officers against suspects, community members, and even other colleagues. The behaviors documented in the report go back more than a generation, certainly as long as I've lived in Minneapolis, since 1981. Black neighbors have been telling us all of this for years, but despite complaints from black citizens, mayors, and city councils for 40 years since I moved have failed to enact meaningful reform. White citizens have apparently been comfortable with that status quo. Our neighborhoods have been relatively safe. Policing seems to work for us. We have not personally experienced the dehumanizing behaviors documented in the report. And by our inaction and indifference, we white Minneapolitans have tacitly endorsed the state of affairs. Yet the behaviors documented in the report are deeply traumatizing to our black neighbors. There have been unwarranted killings, unwarranted arrests, stops, and harassment. Black people's daily lives are made permanently fragile by the ever-present risk of encounter with a racist police force that is, in effect, acting on behalf of the white majority of our city. That reality engenders pervasive physical and psychological distress that intrudes on well-being and resurfaces at unexpected moments as debilitating pain, anxiety, or anger. It compromises the quality of life minute by minute for black citizens in my community. Bluntly, the cause of all that trauma is white people. It's not that every individual white person is wicked. And I'm not here to say to you, you are wicked. I'm not here to say that. It's that the whiteness of white people is inseparable from the whiteness of the officers who, in behaviors that have been sanctioned by a white majority, traumatize black citizens. So whiteness becomes the symbol of this violence and indifference. And any white person, simply by representing, embodying this whiteness, is capable of triggering or reanimating the initial physical and psychological distress. I find I have a deeply personal stake in this. I want to be friends with my black neighbors and my black family members. I want good, open, trusting relationships with them. But because I am white, and regardless of my good intentions, I am capable of triggering post-traumatic reactions at any moment. Whiteness feels to me like a menacing force that hovers around me, an unwelcome guest. Whiteness erases other details about my personality, history, actions. and it traumatizes my friends sometimes. I wish that were not so. Last night I was blessed to attend the concert of the Colorado Springs Chorale, supported by the Chamber Orchestra, led by the astonishing pair of Deborah Jenkins-Teskey and Dan Brink. Oh my goodness. It's hard to imagine anything of which the community could be more proud. Also, if I cast my careless eye, my unsystematic eye, over the community, including the singers, the players, the dignitaries who came to honor the musicians, the color guard from Widefield High School, and the entire audience, the people of color that I saw could be numbered on one hand. That's sad. It's not a particular failing of any of the people involved. It's certainly not a reflection of malice. There is certainly no malice. I suspect it is not for want of trying to create a musical community that more perfectly reflects our whole society. But something is wrong. Something intangible and subtle that keeps people apart who should be together. Something that impoverishes us. I find I need to understand race, racism, and hope quite a lot better than I do. I need more than my good intentions. I need understanding that informs changes in my actions. I think we all do. And that is the motive for my reflection today on Christian language and racialized experience. I plan to address 3 questions today. What is race in America? Why is racism so persistent, intractable, resilient? And what's at stake in these questions for people of faith? I'll touch briefly on each of these questions, then make some more complete comments, and end with something encouraging and hopeful for people who know the vocabulary of Christian faith. First, what is race in America today? The scholars Barbara and Karen Fields, one a historian, one a sociologist, have observed that before there is race, there must be racism. That claim surprises at first. It's backwards from the way we usually think about it. But here's what I think they mean. The many racial categories in American life, in the ways that they function to create advantages for some and disadvantages for others, cannot be explained by anything outside the political and social processes that produce what we call race. The political reality of race is mighty. That political reality of race causes gaps in wealth, gaps in educational outcomes, gaps in mortality, gaps in criminal justice outcomes. It causes fear and hostilities. It creates false stereotypes that divide people. It creates art, creates movements. This thing called race seems rich in accomplishments, yet there is no biological or natural difference among people adequate to explain those accomplishments. There are no historical or geographical differences adequate to explain the whole scheme of assumptions and attributions that make a racialized category of humans. All these differences are the effects of political and social processes that humans put in motion. That means before there can even be something that we call race, there has to be a motive to sort humans into categories for some purpose. Hence, racism, or the impulse to divide humans by classifications we call race, must come before the actual classifications become clear. Again, what matters about the thing we call race is nothing biological, nothing fixed in the nature of things. What matters about race is something political, devised by humans, and subject to the possibility of change. There probably are natural differences among population groups, differences that could be detected in the genome. But these natural differences are not the ones that affect people's life chances, their views of one another, their status in a political order. The group differences that actually affect our life chances are all inventions. They're collections of stories and folk wisdom and myths and stereotypes. These stories are installed and solidified in human institutions and laws until finally blackness and whiteness come to seem like natural facts that explain and justify the differences in status and well-being. Well, in truth, they are fictions that produce those differences in status and well-being. It makes no sense to think of race as a noun, a fixed category. It makes more sense to think of race as a verb, as an activity of sorting humans that humans carry out through their political and social lives. So the title of my talk leans on the verb to racialize as a way of getting at this idea. What matters about race and what has effects in our lives is nothing rooted in biology or geographic difference. What matters and has effects is an activity of racializing certain purposes in particular ways for the purpose of social or political advantage. The activity of racializing happens in many ways. To racialize somebody means to tell stories about them, to ascribe traits or behaviors to them, to use them as symbols, to lump them together in stereotypes or make them the target of laws, to make them the subject of myths, to exclude them from important institutions, to deprive them of rights. The cumulative effect of all that racializing activity is to create what counts as race in American life. It happens in the language we use. It happens in the institutions we create. It happens in laws. It happens both intentionally, as when lenders explicitly deem some persons unworthy of credit. It happens subconsciously, as when white people reflexively associate people of color with undesirable things. My second question, you recall, why is racism so persistent, intractable, and resilient? Thinking about race, not as a noun, but as the activity of racializing for the purpose of an advantage, helps us understand why racism is so persistent in American life. As I'll describe in a moment, racialized categories have been with us since the very beginning of the nation, but they have changed constantly to suit changing needs. When one form of racializing has been discredited, others have risen to take its place. When slavery was outlawed, Jim Crow laws took their place. When school segregation was outlawed, school privatization took its place. When the right to vote was secured by law, discriminatory obstacles to voting were raised. Racism persists because racialized categories provide advantages to whites, and we are reluctant to give up those advantages. My third question, what's at stake for Christians or for others who are at ease with the vocabularies and stories and rituals of Christian faith? Churches, together with the stories and symbols and rituals of Christian faith, have played a role, tragically a large role, in racializing Black and white Americans. So there is a demand for accountability that requires unpacking and acknowledging how Christian thought and Christian institutions helped create racialized categories. We can't understand our current plight of living with unjust racialized categories until we understand how our language and institutions sustain those categories. Besides accountability, though, there is a Christian yearning for justice that can only be fulfilled by abandoning the racialized categories we now live with. The faith of Christians directs hope towards peace and justice. Sometimes this vision of peace and justice is called the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes it is called the beloved community. Sometimes it is called shalom. It is a vision of people living in right relationship with one another and with the earth and with all creation. It is a vision of people able to enjoy the blessings of life without fear of violence, discrimination, or hatred. It's a vision of love abounding without fear of ostracism or exploitation. In this vision, people are set free from arbitrary social divisions prompted by greed, prejudice, or clannish mistrust. In this vision, people are right in their own souls. They're not burdened by self-loathing. They're not burdened by historical animosities. They're not divided by faith or sexuality or race or region. Because they do right by one another, they are at ease in their own hearts. For some strands of the Christian community, this hope is referred to a time and place outside of history, after this life, in a life eternal, in a heavenly dwelling. But for other strands of the Christian community, this hope is referred to our own time and place, within the run of history, as a hope that directs our daily actions with the aim of bringing the beloved community about here and now, or at least soon and very soon. The election of Barack Obama tempted many to declare that America had achieved the progressive dream of a post-racial society. It seemed to some on that good day that the nation's long struggle for racial reconciliation had been fulfilled in triumph over the old bigotries. To some, it seemed realistic to hope that a new community of peace and justice was at hand, at least concerning racial identities. Alas, the years since then have taught us that America's struggle with anti-black racism is far from over. Indeed, the premise that white people are in some way superior to others and deserve special status, prestige, and deference in our society, that motivated a large section of the electorate. A political campaign that openly courted the advocates of white supremacy won the White House and continues to command a major political party. Members of that party actively seek to prohibit learning about America's racial history. Allies of that party brandish the battle flag of the old seditious Confederacy. Allies of that party defend statues of Confederate heroes that were first erected during a reign of terror against black citizens who claimed their civil rights. Members of that party call for tough on crime legislation, even as black people continue to be incarcerated at a rate that far exceeds the rate for whites, even for comparable offenses. And unarmed black people continue to die at the hands of law enforcement at a rate that exceeds that of whites. Seems we are not at all a post-racial society. It seems like the vision of the beloved community is not at all near at hand. This may seem like a challenge for blacks and other people of color who must continue the long struggle to name and claim their fundamental rights, including the most basic freedoms and dignity. But as James Baldwin pointed out in the 60s, America's race problem is not a problem for blacks. It's a problem for whites. For we whites devised the scheme of white supremacy. We whites continue to benefit from the legacy of that scheme. It's our souls that are filled with the whole claptrap of silly reasons long given to excuse the exclusion of non-whites from the blessings of life. So today I want to talk also about the harm that racism does to white people like me. I want to talk about how my very soul and life depend on unpacking the long history of America's racializing projects. I want to talk about how my soul depends on naming the ongoing legacy of America's racial history. We white folks, we need to overcome that legacy in our minds, in our speech, in our thoughts, in our institutions, our policies, our worldviews. And the rest of this talk is a step in the direction of helping me and the white people in the room overcome these legacies. We can't be right in the world unless we can do that. First, we need to understand what race means, how the idea emerges, how it functions in our lives, what keeps it alive. As you know well, our nation was founded in a great contradiction. In a bold rejection of ancient hierarchies of kings and bishops, our founders declared, all men are created equal, and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Yet in the very moment of that declaration, they were profiting handsomely from the forced labors of enslaved people. The southern colonies profited directly from the crops grown and harvested by enslaved labor. The northern colonies profited from the economic infrastructure of lending, insuring, and shipping that enslaved workforce. Neither party, neither South nor North, was willing to surrender those profits to live up to the creed, all men are created equal. The South enslaved, the North facilitated. I say it as a son of northern families. In my family, we used to think, well, at least we aren't the Southerners. And that was wrong thinking, because our families and our economies and our regions turned a blind eye, facilitated, accommodated, acquiesced, funded, shipped, mortgaged, insured. To wrestle with the contradiction between the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the profits of enslaving people, a sturdy narrative to rationalize the exclusion of Africans from the category all men was needed. On the strength of that exclusion, it was possible for the founders to declare that all men are equal, and nevertheless to maintain that the peoples of Africa were not the men named in the Declaration, but something less than men, and rightly available for enslavement. It took a civil war, 3 amendments to our Constitution, and numerous court cases to end the laws that enshrined enslavement. It turns out that was the easy part. The scheme of ideas that rationalized slavery on the grounds that black people were inferior and white people superior has lived on into the present day. That scheme of ideas turns out to be so hardy and persistent that even when the legal basis for slavery ended, the scheme of ideas simply generated new laws, policies, and customs to prop up the notion of white supremacy. As slavery ended, new laws were passed to consolidate the social superiority of whites. These so-called Jim Crow laws criminalized almost every detail of a black person's life, such that imprisonment was an ever-looming threat. Then, the lost labor of enslaved people could be replaced by systems of convict leasing, where blacks convicted for violating Jim Crow laws were leased out to landowners to do the work previously provided by enslaved persons. Jim Crow laws raised nearly insurmountable barriers to voting, excluded black students from schools and universities, empowered white citizens to discriminate in business, in employment, in housing, and outright prohibited the integration of most places of business. Because blacks were excluded from voting rolls, they were also excluded from jury service, with the result that blacks accused of crimes never confronted a jury of peers. They confronted juries of whites who were devoted to upholding the scheme of white supremacy. Because whites were legally permitted to discriminate in employment and housing, blacks were prevented from building wealth, let alone transmitting that wealth to later generations. Because schools were segregated, blacks often lacked fair access to adequate facilities. And it was not merely law and custom that propped up the social fact of white supremacy. From the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries, a regime of extrajudicial killings terrorized black communities. The Equal Justice Initiative of Bryan Stevenson calls these racial terror lynchings. They were ritualized theatrical mob murders whose intent was to terrify and intimidate a whole population. By turning the bodies of black victims into spectacle, they strengthened the assumption of black inferiority and white superiority. The legacy of those killings live on in the memories of both the victim communities and also the perpetrator communities. The great campaigns for civil rights in the 50s and 60s led to legislation and legal decisions that dismantled much of the Jim Crow legacy. Still, the claims of white supremacy reasserted themselves in evolving forms. When courts required school desegregation, white parents moved to white enclaves on the edge of urban centers. They enrolled their children in private and church-related schools and demanded government funding to subsidize their choices. To this very day, there is an uproar about parents' supposed right to dictate the content of their children's education in terms favorable to their white selves. To suit the demands of these fragile parents, 25 states have introduced legislation that effectively bans truthful learning about America's racialized history. When courts enforced non-discrimination laws, white business owners and property owners claimed religious exemptions to impose discriminatory views, and they defended these as deeply held, sincerely held religious views. And to this day, white business owners assert a right to discriminate according to the supposed dictates of their conscience. 40 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court rejected the provision for pre-clearance of changes to voting laws in jurisdictions with a history of discrimination. And immediately thereafter, those jurisdictions went to work passing voting laws that disproportionately burden black voters. When courts rejected explicitly discriminatory policing, legislatures developed new, purportedly race-neutral frameworks that continue to criminalize blackness. The gravest example is the so-called war on drugs, Mr. Nixon's great innovation. The rhetoric, policies, and laws of the war on drugs empowered local enforcement agencies to enforce drug laws selectively and gave prosecutors discretion to impose ever harsher sentencing. The result has been that, even though drug use is comparable among all racial groups, black men are overwhelmingly likely to be entrapped in the criminal justice system, even for offenses that are routinely overlooked in white communities. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, a third of black men are likely to be snared in the criminal justice system over the course of their lifetimes. Not because of excess criminality, but simply because of differential policing and prosecution. It's true that exceptional black men and women achieve visible success, but that does not stop them from being pulled over for minor traffic offenses or no offense at all by officers exercising their discretion. In many urban centers now, many black men are in jail. It leaves their families without benefit of potential income and parenting. It becomes the cause for a lot of hand-wringing about the alleged social crisis of the black family. But the so-called crisis in black families is not a crisis of values or culture. It's a crisis of overly aggressive criminal justice, channeled through the war on drugs and targeting black citizens. You can't be a father to your family if you're incarcerated by an overzealous prosecutor for a crime that would have been winked at if a white fraternity boy had done it. At long last, Congress has passed a bill explicitly criminalizing race lynching. It's called the Emmett Till Act. Math, 60 years too late. Nevertheless, black citizens continue to die in encounters with police using excessive force without accountability. Periodically, it seems, after a lot of talk about lofty principles of equality and opportunity, our country formally rejects legalized discrimination, and yet these examples suggest that the scheme of white supremacy and black disenfranchisement implacably reasserts itself. Just how does that scheme exert such a hold on the imagination of Americans? In the early days of the Republic, the first defenders of enslaving people relied on pseudoscience, on biblical reasoning, and on folk wisdom to prop up the commitment to black inferiority and white supremacy. Tragically, the vocabulary of their pseudoscience persists to this day. The pseudoscience of the colonial era thought that race was in the blood. Jim Crow discrimination classified any person as black who had 1 drop of black blood. Biologists and geneticists know this to be a nonsensical concept. Blood is blood. But racists still talk about white and black blood. Modern-day ethno-nationalists base their claims to special status on blood and soil, even though blood has no role in transmitting any trait from generation to generation. And as I said earlier, modern genetics, too, rejects the notion that race is a genetically meaningful concept. The groups of humans who are identified as belonging to, quote, different races, actually share the overwhelming majority of the genome in common, and the genetic differences, the genomic differences amongst individuals within a racial group dwarf the genetic differences between the so-called groups. So it means that race, in the sense of classifications that make a difference politically, cannot be explained as biological difference. Instead, they're differences that matter politically and socially, the ones that are tallied on a census form, the ones that animate racist hostility and dread. They're themselves products of the political and social process. It's what sociologists call a social construct, or what I've been calling a racializing activity. To say race is constructed doesn't mean that it's unreal. It's absolutely solid. It means that what counts as black or white in culture emerges from many sources. It emerges from language and imaginative schemes. It emerges from laws, customs, and institutions. Legislators are constructing race. They're summoning it into being. When they pass laws that result in differential outcomes, bankers are summoning race into being when they construct it, when they treat borrowers of different groups differently. Employers construct race when they prefer one race or another for particular job duties. Peer groups construct race when they settle on conventions of fashion or deportment, and when they jeer at nonconformers. As I say, to call race a construct doesn't mean it's not real. But whatever it means for an individual to be black or white is the outcome of an interplay of laws, institutions, ideologies, mythologies, social pressures, and personal idiosyncrasies. I myself take a pretty strong view of the power of language to predetermine what we are likely to think about or even able to think about. What we have words for, we think about easily and regard as natural. What we don't have words for, we struggle to regard as real. When our language is full of idioms and symbolic connections that treat blackness one way and whiteness another, it's very hard even to think anything different. It's harder still to argue for changes in laws or practices that could change the material reality of people who are boxed in as black or white. Christian theology and Christian churches were and remain influential in the construction of race. Christian churches provided scriptural warrants for the systems of white supremacy and black enslavement. Christian churches often segregated themselves. Denominations divided over the question, could people worship in common? There are denominations in the country today that still have covertly racist language in their charters. They often relied on biblical passages to justify these exclusions. I'm going to mention one. I'll try to describe it to you, and it's almost comic in its flimsiness. And yet it became a robust platform for antebellum defenders of slavery to claim divine sanction for enslaving people. It appears in Genesis 9:22 to 29. Some of you will have encountered it already. It's an obscure story about Noah. Having survived the flood, Noah, who was a man of the field and cultivated vineyards, became drunk and went to sleep in his tent. One of his sons, Ham, entered the tent and, in a characteristically cryptic biblical phrase, saw his father's nakedness. No explanation given, simply the phrase, saw his father's nakedness. He comes out of the tent, and two brothers place a cloak on their shoulders and back into the tent to cover Noah's nakedness without laying eyes on him. Upon awakening, the angry Noah cursed the son who saw his nakedness and cursed all of that son's offspring. This story of the curse of Ham, or as it is alternatively known, the curse of Canaan, who was Ham's son, was spun up by pro-slavery exegetes as a divine mandate for the enslavement of any and all Africans by any and all Europeans. They asserted that Ham was etymologically connected to the peoples of Africa, the dark and moist continent, more pseudoscience. And they asserted that Shem and Japheth, the other brothers, were the progenitors of Europe. And so the brief story was represented as justification for a whole institution of enslaving people. Hard to imagine a thinner reed on which to hang a whole thing, and yet they made it work. They also pointed to the fact that the patriarchs of old in their households included enslaved people, not noticing the differences in kind of those households. They also noted that the so-called household codes of pseudo-Pauline literature in the New Testament, borrowed from Aristotelian reasoning about a well-ordered society, instructed slaves to be obedient to their masters as to the Lord. There's testimony from enslaved people in the Old South that they despised going to church under the auspices of the white master because the preaching would always harp on the pseudo-Pauline directive, be obedient to your masters. They liked better the preaching that said, God led the people out from Egypt. Moreover, ancient theological schemes created systems of symbols arranged in ranked pairs that provided convenient cover for American racism. This is important to me because I think our minds are organized by schemes of symbols that do work without our even noticing the work they do. And early Christianity bequeathed us a scheme of symbols where the symbols were organized in pairs and the pairs were ranked. The early theology of the Christian church treated the body and soul as separable parts of a human life. The soul was the true self that might win eternal life through faith and discipline. The body was a mere stumbling block, which tied the soul to lower worldly things, pleasures, vices, sensuality. The work of a Christian life was to control and discipline the body so that the temptations represented by body life would not distract from the work of the soul to know God, to purify itself, and become worthy of eternal life. Once those symbols, indebted to Plato perhaps, richly elaborated by St. Augustine and many other church fathers, once those symbols were in place, they became mobile. Once those symbols and their ranked organization was set, those symbols could be attached to other things, mapped, as it were, onto other social realities, and provide justification for the ranking of other social realities. It's no surprise that the early church was also an androcentric and patriarchal church, because the men associated themselves with soul, and they associated women with body. And since soul is meant to subjugate body, they had a blueprint for a social organization of life, which gives rise to the patriarchal family. Tomorrow, in Sunday's worship service, I will turn my way of thinking about these questions to gender. I'll talk about how corrupt and idolatrous the patriarchal family is, and how those institutions, many of which are centered in Colorado Springs, that prop up the patriarchal family, are practicing a kind of idolatry. Now I want to think about how that symbolism of a ranked pair, soul and body, was mapped onto racialized categories in the early days of the Republic. As American slaveholders sought to rationalize their subjugation of Africans, they found it expedient to tie their own whiteness to the symbol of the soul, with its connotations of superior virtue and right of rule. Conversely, they tied the Africans symbolically to the body, with its connotations of vice and lust. Using this device of the familiar mind-body abstraction, they were able to characterize themselves as superior in intelligence, self-discipline, and moral sense. And they characterized the peoples of Africa as intellectually simple, careless, and morally lax. Stereotypes from the era of enslavement clearly show the structure of this Christian theological dualism. Enslaved black men were called black bucks, a metaphor from the animal world, the body with its brute force. Mr. Reagan trafficked in that metaphor, for goodness sake. Enslaved women were sometimes called Jezebel, with a connotation of sexual voraciousness. White slaveholders used this metaphor to articulate a claim that black women sexually hungered for them, and then they could excuse their rape of their own chattel. She made me do it. I think back to one of the great human vices that the Jewish and Christian traditions have known how to name. It's the deferring of blame. Adam, in the garden, ate the fruit that had been forbidden to him. The Lord found him walking in the garden and said, "Adam, Adam, what have you done?" And Adam's answer was, "The woman whom thou gavest me, she gave me the fruit, and I did eat." The original sin, deferring responsibility, denying accountability. And the white slave holders, who were so many of them rapists, they would deny accountability by saying, "The women of Africa are voracious. They cannot be withstood." This is shocking to relate. In the early history of our nation, whiteness and Christian identity were closely linked. The nation actively sought to keep its borders secure and its people pure. 19th century legislators unapologetically pursued immigration policy that favored people from what they called Christian lands and explicitly barred non-Christians from citizenship on the grounds that they could not be expected to assimilate to the values and virtues of Christians. It's not too much to say that early American Christianity was a religion of whiteness, where whiteness signified God's favor, intelligence, self-control, refinement, rule. To be white was to be the protagonist in God's providential design. Other peoples were incidental to God's history unfolding in white people. Other people could be freely exploited in the pursuit of God's plan. It's also not too much to say that the identification of Christianity and whiteness has resurfaced in recent years powerfully. It was on display in Charlottesville. It was on display on January 6th. Of course, it's important to differentiate the whiteness I've been talking about from the fact that some people have white skin. This is a very important message for me and for you to hear. Whiteness is a scheme of ideas. It preoccupies our imaginations. It causes us to think badly and tolerate bad outcomes. But it's not the same as simply being a person with fair skin, white skin. White skin is an irrelevant accident of biography. It doesn't mean anything by itself. It takes an active program of racializing individual identities to turn light skin into something with consequences for banking access or school access or freedom from police harassment. It takes an active program of racializing to turn white skin into something significant, because by itself, white skin is just a quirk. It's just a thing. So whiteness, distinct from white people, is a concept and a scheme of ideas meant to make the supremacy of white people seem right, natural, and pleasing to God. Whiteness names those linguistic, psychological, social, political, institutional, mythical patterns that perpetuate the notion of white supremacy in all things. It's the name of an evil ideology. And it has to be possible to say bluntly that whiteness, or the complex of practices and ideas that sustains an ideology of white supremacy, whiteness is evil, without saying each white person is evil. And believe me, I do not abuse the privilege of the white lectureship to stand in front of you, white people, and say you're evil. That's not why I'm here. But I'm here to say that we are all fish swimming in water, and the water is the ideology of whiteness. And that ideology is subtle, hard to see, pervasive, consequential, and wicked. Individual white people are not individually responsible for the past crimes of white racists. That is a distraction that many modern-day racists try to pull. I didn't enslave anybody, they like to say, as if that were a way to stop conversation about racial reckoning. And nobody is saying that the white people today were the enslavers. At the same time, white people today live in systems of institutions and myths that collectively work to perpetuate white advantage and black disadvantage. This whiteness is the context of all our lives. Whiteness as ideology is obviously both tempting and extremely dangerous for Christians. It's tempting because whiteness is an ideology that boosts the self-esteem of white people. It's an ideology that tempts us to think well of ourselves, even when we're involved in systems that harm our neighbors. To identify faith with a racial category is the most brazen idolatry. The one thing we know, thou shalt have no God but God. The one thing we know is that we shall not worship something that isn't God. And there is a temptation to worship whiteness because it gives so many benefits. It's a small g God, a little idol that hands out short-term benefits. So I say that to identify faith with a racial category is the most brazen idolatry. The God of the Bible is the God of all creation, the God of Abraham, the God who comes to die on a cross in solidarity with all who suffer. That God's love is impartial. A person may embrace whiteness or God, but not both. The God of creation declares creation good, and God saw that it was good. All of it, not some of it. The people, those sinners, are welcomed into friendship, reconciled with God. All of the people, not some of the people. Indeed, the Bible's witness to God's presence in the world has a political slant, and it's a slant that tilts hard against whiteness. For God enters history in solidarity with the least, most despised, most outcast. The Lord casts the mighty down. The enslaved Israelites find favor with God, who intervenes in history to facilitate their exodus, their liberation from enslavement. God enters the world in the person of a backcountry Jew under the thumb of the mighty Roman Empire and at odds with Jewish temple leadership. In the person of Jesus, God befriends the pariahs of his day, women, tax gatherers, the infirm, the unclean. In modern language, one might say he comes in friendship with the queers, with the losers, with the victims of empire. And if ever there was an empire, whiteness is an empire. Rome was mighty, whiteness is mighty. In the intentional provocation of James Cone, the great liberation theologian, Jesus is black. Because Jesus does not come on the side of the powerful. He comes on the side of those who've been excluded by the powerful ideologies of his day. So I think Cone is right to say and to provoke, Jesus is black. I think it's a hard stumbling block for white Christians to read the story of Jesus' ministry, trial, and crucifixion, and to realize that if white Christians are to identify with anybody in that story, they dare not identify with Jesus, because white Christians are the empire. And so we must learn with sorrow in our hearts to identify with Rome and to figure out ways to reconcile and repair and to break our identification with Rome, with Pilate, with the Jewish temple authority. We must learn to be in solidarity with the one on the cross. We can do it in our own time and place. We can do it by taking whatever steps are within our reach to dismantle whiteness, that wicked empire, and to stand in solidarity with those who are closer to the meaning of the cross. Blacks, people of color, queers, gender outliers, all those beautiful and precious people whom God declares good with no qualification. We can learn to stand with those people. The witness of the New Testament, which is good news to the poor, is woe to the rich who have had their day. It's woe to whiteness. Communities that take their bearings from the scriptures of Israel and the New Testament, who seek guidance from the accounts of Jesus' life, have a distinct role to play in this country's racial reckoning. Reckoning means acknowledging a past, which we've been trying to do now. It means turning a critical eye on the status quo and its many rationalizations. It means owning up to unearned advantages. It means learning to listen to the voices of dispossessed peoples. It means standing in material and spiritual solidarity with dispossessed peoples, taking active steps to reform the systems that perpetuate ideologies of white supremacy. It means learning not to be the center of everything, emotionally, cognitively, or economically. Communities that take their bearings from Christian faith can seek to own how their languages have facilitated white supremacy in the past. They can challenge their neighbors who perpetuate the fusion of Christian identity and racial or national identities. They can seek to convert their hearts to the work of racial justice. I don't think this will be easy. Whiteness confers advantages on white people, short-term, cheap advantages. It's like a kind of wealth, built up of values that do not matter, and squandering values that do matter. Matthew's gospel remembers Jesus warning the people. I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Christians are taught to yearn for the coming realm of peace and justice, the blessed community, shalom, the kingdom of God. But that community of justice can only come when the ideology of whiteness has been put away. Because white people derive value from whiteness, we are like the rich person who struggles to pass through the eye of a needle, to leave whiteness behind for a new way of being, reconciled to all and living together with open hearts. It will be hard for us to do this, like for a camel to get through the eye of a needle, because we will have to give things up. But the things we will have to give up are no good to us, and something better is available. friendship, reconciliation, community with all the people. Christian resources lend energy and focus to all this work I'm talking about. Christian communities have access to the most basic of commandments. Love your neighbor. But it's not easy. And since people like to know when the end is nigh, I tell you there are 3 more sentences. Two, but one is a run-on. We can start by keeping watch on our school boards, legislatures, law enforcement, and communities. And we can demand accountability when they are propping up whiteness and undermining the chance for all of us to enjoy the blessings of life. When those institutions act to reinforce whiteness, to perpetuate the ancient patterns of dehumanizing racial formations, we will confront them with the witness of God's love, universal and not partial. Thank you so much for your attention. You are very generous to me to extend this invitation and to clap as you just did. And perhaps you have made it to the finish line now and would love to go and have a cup of coffee, and I will not blame you if that is true. But if you have questions or things you would like me to consider, I am your servant. Jackie.
I want to start. I usually don't, but I want to start. Can you tell us a little bit about your racial awakening? Because I think the first question from most of us are going to be, so what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? We want to fix this. But what I have learned is that we have to grieve it first. That has to be part of the healing, not just for people of color, but for ourselves. We have to grieve that. If you can tell us how you've done that, because I can see the tears.
I want to be explicit about my tears. They don't matter. I'm not asking for people to bend their lives out of shape to sympathize with the strong feelings I have. I've got to reckon with the strong feelings I have. So I cried through my whole college career. I cried at literature. I cried at music. And I would just say to my students, it doesn't bug me. So don't you get all bent out of shape if I'm weepy about a great metaphor in Virgil or a ringing passage from Toni Morrison. Just let me cry. It's just what I do. The first thing is that I give credit to my mother. You admire her, so you'll enjoy this story. She deserves to have this story told. Many of you know it already, but not all of you. She was somewhat recently divorced, and she was taking her young son, me, across the country. We were flying to see her family back in New England. My grandfather on my father's side had been a professor of theology at Boston University School of Theology. He was there at the time Dr. King was a student at Boston University School of Theology. And Dr. King was my grandfather's student. And my grandfather was fascinated with Gandhi as well as with a lot of other important figures. And a lot of his teaching was biography, where he plumbed biography to get theological meaning. Dr. King learned about Gandhi and the philosophy of nonviolence from many people at Boston University School of Theology, including my grandfather. My mother and I changed planes at O'Hare in Chicago at a time when there was a sanitation worker strike in Chicago. Dr. King, as is well known by the progressive left and denied utterly by the reactionary right, was a champion of workers' rights, was a champion of class transformation, and he called for a natural solidarity of black working people and white working people to overcome the threat that capitalism represents to the dignity of people. And so he was in Chicago in solidarity with a sanitation workers' strike, as he had been in Memphis when he was killed. And my mother and I were changing planes in O'Hare. I was a kid. She had me by the hand. We were walking along. When a fast-walking group of men, you can picture them because you've seen pictures, handsome, brave, in dark suits and white shirts and narrow ties, walking rapidly. And my mother recognized Dr. King at the center of this group. Presumably Jesse Jackson Jr. was there, perhaps Ralph Abernathy. And she said, you know, in her mind, I imagine her saying, well, you're the son of Edwin Prince Booth, and he had been a professor of Dr. King. We're going to go meet Dr. King. And I was a boy humiliated by this spectacle of being dragged around to meet a famous person. And I said, no, Mom, no, don't do it. And to her credit, she knew what was important at that moment, and my squeamishness, my embarrassment as a boy, was not nearly as important. And so, I'm going to answer your question, Jackie, in two questions. This is just in two stories. This is just the first one. She caught up with the group, walking fast. Dr. King, Dr. King. And the group of men around Dr. King were worried because he was subject to death threats all the time. And threats of physical violence swirled around him all the time. And there was no reason to trust the white lady and the little boy who were running along, but she kept saying, Dr. King, Dr. King. And he paused, and she said, Dr. King, I want you to meet the grandson of Edwin Prince Booth. And he bent down, and he took my hand, and he said, how nice, how nice. You don't change your heart or convert your worldview by meeting a famous person. And yet, it caused me to pay attention to his legacy and to notice it, and to notice the way people pervert and distort his legacy. Like modern day proto-racists who take his one line, judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin, as if that could be an end of all explicit racial consideration, while all the implicit racial consideration is allowed to go on and on and on. I've been paying attention to Dr. King, and I've been moved by his rhetoric, and I've been trying to understand him. And I think part of that is because my mother had the gumption to insist that I would meet an important person who was a hero of our day. That's what my white tears, pay no attention. The other story is quite a bit more personal, and I need to be discreet about how I tell it, because it involves another person. It involves a person. It involves a person that I care about quite a lot, a woman of color, a woman who survived lots of abuse at the hands of white people, death threats, family abuse, a white stepfather. And I love her, and I'm close to her. And there was a moment, about a month before the murder of George Floyd in my city, there was a moment when I carelessly misestimated my whiteness. And I proposed that, she's a musician and I'm a hobby musician, and I proposed a song for her to consider. It's a song with a racial subtext. And I thought, songwriter to songwriter, we might be able to talk about whether the song worked in its purposes or didn't. And I sang the song for her. And the song wounded her. It wounded her because, it touched on all of the raw nerves that a lifetime with whiteness had made in her. And I didn't know that at the time. And it prompted an estrangement between the two of us that lasted some months, and prompted some hard reflection from me about how little I understood the force of the whiteness I carry with me, the presumption that I can do what I set out to do and it will be good. I'm really accustomed to thinking that I can do the things I plan to do and it will be good. But that's whiteness talking in me. That's not grounded in any real understanding of the situation I'm in. I owed her so much more by way of permission to speak in the way I did. I owed her so much more sensitivity about how my actions and words would reanimate an old trauma and produce post-traumatic stress. And she and I have worked long and hard at a reconciliation, and she has honored me by accepting my effort to understand what transpired between us and what I need to do to be a more reliable friend to her, in spite of my power, which isn't my power, but is the power of whiteness clinging to me unwelcome all the time, to hurt her again. And that was a real moment of conversion, and it taught me solidarity with the black neighbors in Minneapolis, in the political causes, in the campaigns. That's far too much of an answer. Thank you, Jackie, for that good question.
Hi there, my name is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I think I have 3 little points to touch on. 1, white woman's tears. Don't even go there anymore, because it was brought up to me, and I really keep that in front of me when I think about how I can make any change in my life. 2, 30 years since Rodney King, and I think that was yesterday's date, and I think, gosh, we've made like a half of a step for 30 years. The next thing is about systems, where I think that systems can be, where I can do the most in systems. And the systemic issues, and one that I was thinking of, was tipping.
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 Thank you.
And how, because you brought up this whole idea of the North going, thank God we're not the South, you know? And I really related to that. And I thought to myself, in my own history, I'm not responsible for 200 years ago, but I have a responsibility. And I keep that in front of me. And I think about how tipping came about when people from the South needed jobs and they were only given tips, the porters on the trains. And I think that's a very interesting backbone and system in our country that we haven't really addressed. There are people in this very town who are addressing that in their own businesses, which I think is great. But I just wanted to offer that as a form of research that I've just started. But thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Sarah. What a wonderful example. And if I could add about the tipping economy, a person's survival in the tipping economy requires them to ingratiate themselves to the one who might give them a tip. And so if it is a sexualized workplace, then the person has to tolerate the improper attention of the diner or the bar patron, because that's how they'll get the tip. Since the tip economy relies on a power difference between the one who needs it for survival and the one who can give it, it requires the one who needs the tip always to ingratiate and abase themselves to some extent. I know that it often happens with extreme dignity and niceties, but it has an ominous history and an ominous present. Thanks for that example. Yeah.
I appreciate very much your sensitivity and the academic attention that you've given to these issues. What I'm wondering is, I have family members who deny that they have anything to do with racism and so forth. Yeah. And this particular family member is sort of on the second level of caste, and so he feels threatened by affirmative action and anything that's done that might elevate black people above his position. And what I'm wondering is, and I'm not expecting a formula, but how to approach or talk to him about these issues. Your metaphor of the ocean of whiteness is helpful to me. Do you have any other suggestions in that regard?
Yeah. Gosh, I admire you so much for just your faithfulness to family members who just experience and see the world a little bit differently, and to remain in a dialogue with them because of your commitment to a certain vision of the justice we need to seek is just great. I want to get at the thing you're talking about by meditating a little bit on the concept of privilege. Many of you know the concept of privilege and white privilege as an important insight of activists and scholars who recognize that certain identities in the scheme of white supremacy, the scheme of whiteness, certain identities have advantages that are built into the rhetoric and the institutions around them. And so things go better for them. And we began to talk about male privilege and white privilege. And people got pretty comfortable. People in certain circles got pretty comfortable talking about male privilege and white privilege. Of course, there are many white people who have been viciously harmed by rampant capitalism. They've been dehumanized and cast to the gutter by unfettered capitalism. And if you tell them that they are the bearers of privilege, they take umbrage, because they can point to all the ways they've been harmed by the systems they live in. And so I think a lot about how, if we're going to talk about privilege in a useful way, we have to talk about how subtly it's distributed in the world. And there are whole strata of advantage and disenfranchisement in the scheme of whiteness. And the scheme of whiteness really relies on all of those layers of disenfranchisement. And it relies on continually sparking strife amongst those layers. You probably are familiar with, many of you are probably familiar with the phrase a racial bargain, which describes a cultural bargain that the old planters of the pre-war South offered to poor whites. The bargain was simple. You will remain poor, but you will have the privilege of your whiteness. We planters will remain rich, and we will keep you poor, because by keeping you poor and doing tenant labor on our farm, we can keep our wealth. You might be tempted to make common cause with the freed slaves because you're all impoverished by my wealth. But I have a bargain for you, which is that I will allow you to walk on the sidewalk while your black neighbor has to step to the street, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the whole kit and caboodle of white, prestige, claims white prestige. And I think that a version of the racial bargain is happening all the time now, as unfettered capitalism tries to persuade people in other castes that it's black people who are hurting you. And of course, it's never black people who are hurting white people. You said it would be okay if I didn't give you a formula, and I was grateful for that exemption. All I can give you is some reflections that you in your own good wisdom will figure out how to talk with your relatives.
My name's Mary Jane, and I have a question. We all have white privilege in this community, of course. We all know that. We've been well schooled in our white privilege. What I want to ask you is, what can we actually do about it? And that was kind of your question, Jackie.
Yeah.
It's, other than becoming an absolute fanatical political person, and what really, really bothers me the most right now is the fact that the voting rights have been, stripped from people of color
Yeah.
all over this community, all over this nation. And I feel like we don't really have any agency that we can attend to that at all. I mean, we try to vote for the right people, but that's just a tiny, tiny piece. What can we actually do right now?
I sense discouragement, and I identify with that discouragement. I think that people died for the right to vote over and over and over again. They stood in lines. They stepped up to, county registrar, clerk counters. People died for the right to vote. To vote is not a small thing. To lobby, to make a contribution, to make a phone call, to write an email to a legislator. These are the things that are available to us. We have to do them. If everybody in the sanctuary today sends email to a legislator, it's not nothing. If everybody in the sanctuary today asks a friend to come and vote, it's not nothing. And so we have to do those things. And you also mentioned the fact that we've been trying hard to understand and label white privilege. And I actually think we deserve credit. We white people deserve credit for trying to do that. But we can't rest on our laurels either, because if I have really learned anything in this half dozen years that I've been working hard on these questions, it's that white privilege is both more subtle than we think, harder to recognize than we think, and harder to give up than we think. And so I give myself a pep talk every day, and I don't want to scold anyone, but I would ask you just to hear the pep talk I give myself, which is, your white privilege is deeper than you recognize, so be ready to notice that it's even deeper than you think. Be ready to be surprised when your white privilege pops up in a way that you hadn't thought of before. And be ready to take some action in your personal friendships, in your relationships, to relinquish the white privilege. I'm conscious that I am talking to a community that is men and women, and I identified myself as a white man at the beginning, and I know that my gender is a seat of privilege for me too. I know that white women are complexly situated in the discussion of privilege, because white women are mightily privileged by whiteness and mightily deprivileged by being women. And so, Mary Jane, I'm talking to you now because you asked me that good, hard question, but I'm talking to the whole community here that I dare not get bossy about renouncing privilege, because I have a lot of it, and we all have it in different ways, and it comes into our lives in different ways. So I can't globally scold us to renounce our privilege, because I don't know what I'm talking about if I'm trying to talk about your life. Your life has whatever privilege it has, given the many layers of how you are socially identified. So, two things. Do the political acts that are available to us to do. They're consequential, and people have died for us to have them. A fight against subversions of the Voting Rights Act by emailing people, by voting, and also be especially mindful of privilege which clings to us even in ways we don't yet recognize. I suspect tomorrow I will learn more dimensions of my own privilege, and I will try to figure out how to shed them. Except that, sinner as I am, I probably cling to a lot of them because they work for me. I'm ashamed to admit it's hard work. I'm the rich man trying to get through a skinny place. You have been standing.
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
I have a simple and a complex question.
Oh.
How are we to think about the call for reparations?
The question was, how should we think about the call for reparations? Kathy represented that to me as both a simple and a complex question. That's pretty astute. It's a simple and a complex question. The first thing is that I think the case for reparations is rock solid. I'm a wealthy person. I'm not the 10th of a percent or 100th of a percent, and I don't have a rocket ship. But I'm a wealthy person because I can live safely in this world. I can survive a health emergency. I've got a house to live in. I can do the things I want to do. A lot of the ways that the wealth came to me was by generational transfers of wealth. My parents were secure. They weren't rich either, but they were secure. And because they were secure, and they had a lot of social capital, cultural capital. They knew people. I was able to meet people because of them. People were able to create opportunities for me. The good old banking family of the community for a long time ran the little community ski area on Pikes Peak. And as a 14-year-old, I was given a silly little job because the bankers knew Marty. And I've had innumerable advantages like that. And so my wealth today, I love the formula somebody gave. I'm not responsible for this, but I have to take responsibility for what happens now. The security of my life right now cannot be separated from the systems that helped my family amass a certain amount of wealth and transmit it from generation to generation. And those systems include things like differential mortgage lending, differential access to schools, differential access to employment. So I am rich now, and a large part of the reason I'm rich is whiteness. And there are poor people in my community who are black or other people of color, and in particular Minneapolis indigenous communities, who are poor, and they are poor because of generations of spoliation, expropriation, robbery, deprivation. What should I do knowing those facts? The answer is I should be ready to give something if that giving can begin to repair the harm done to other communities. I should be ready, and I don't think I should be satisfied by individually giving money. I should be working for a community-wide, a state, a government, an official, a public gesture of righting the financial harm that was done. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the great editor of the 1619 Project, wrote a wonderful article about the case for reparations. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has also written about the case for reparations. They're really compelling cases. How it's to be done and exactly who's to be the beneficiary are very complicated, and that's kind of what you were getting at when you said it was a complicated question. Who should pay it is the people. And we should pay for it in the way we pay for other important public works and public commitments, which is that as we are able to, we should pay for it. And that means according to our tax code. For the moment, I'm going to speak optimistically and not realistically, and I'm going to say, assume the tax code is a fair representation of people's ability to contribute to the welfare of the country. And then out of the tax revenues of our country, we should pay reparations. And I don't know the forms that should take. And even short of reparations, when we have a chance to talk to our legislators and elected officials, we should be insisting on investment in community development and job growth in the neighborhoods that were harmed by redlining. That should be, just to choose a rough number, roughly equal to the subsidies we give to the fossil fuel industry. That was a little bit of snark, for which I apologize. But we should be investing. And when people talk about crime, the wave of carjackings, crime in the streets, no politician should be allowed to get away with talking about tougher sentencing. They should all be required to talk about jobs and school funding. And that should be one of the modes of reparation, perhaps. What a great question. Thank you.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. One, you talked about that we have, for the things that we have words for, we think about easily, and we struggle to conceptualize things for which we don't have words or phrases. Now, I mean, for me, that begs the question, can you articulate some of those things that I'm, handicapped from conceptualizing because I don't have the words for?
Gosh, that's a great question. And so if we were really going to address that question, we would need some heavy-duty philosophy about cognition and communication. But let's stick at a practical level. And let's differentiate between what a community at large is able to talk about easily and what individuals who reflect hard and learn from their reflection and struggle together, what they're able to come up with. An analogy comes to my mind. It's an analogy that comes up in a book called Epistemological Injustice. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that talks about what we're able to know. Injustice suggests that you can't know it. And actually, there are two quick examples. One is that same-gender desire lacked a vocabulary to describe itself until a kind of recent politics. And prior to that, it was subject to a hostile, psychologizing vocabulary. And so people who experienced love for people of the same gender thought of themselves as inverts or suffering from psychological complexes. They were shot through with self-loathing because a majority medical establishment afflicted them with derogatory theory. And it took the emergence through a combination of activist efforts and theoretical academic efforts to come up with a new vocabulary so that now it's possible in many communities, I know this is work in progress, but it's possible in many communities for kids to come out as gay. And this is not, in many communities, it's not fraught or perilous. It's just a happy recognition that this is who I am, and it's fabulous. And what a wonderful thing that a new vocabulary emerged, new language. The other example is in a way more telling. It comes from the 60s, I believe. It involves a group of women talking about political events in their lives. I think it involves Cornell University, if I remember rightly, and a secretary at Cornell University. There may be people in the room who know this story and can correct my memory. A secretary, a woman, in an academic department of Cornell University was subject to sexual harassment, except the conceptual and theoretical framework sexual harassment did not exist. And so what she experienced was that people were flirting with her. And she didn't welcome their flirtations, but it was thought to be, not fun and gracious and sporty to not go along with a little friendly flirtation. And she complained to her supervisor, so-and-so keeps putting his hands on me and asking for dates, and I don't want, oh, says the supervisor, he's just being fun. He's been a pillar of our community and besides, what's wrong with a little romance in the office? Terrible things were said. I feel a little vulnerable right now because I tried a joking tone of voice to represent the voice of a harasser, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm joking about harassment. The woman lost her job, and she had no way to describe what had happened. And she went to the group of women who convened, in those days, brilliantly, such meetings were called consciousness-raising sessions, because they were raising our consciousness about things we had no words for. And she told her story, and one of the women in the group, according to the legend, one of the women in the group said, wow, you've been harassed. You've been harassed in your workplace. You've been sexually harassed. You've been harassed on account of sex. And then the phrase sexual harassment was part of the vocabulary. Then it could become part of legal reasoning and part of legal argumentation, and causes of action could be brought about. And there could be a little bit of restitution. up until the point that you're nominated to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that helps. This will be easier, I think, but that helped. You mentioned white Christians justifying enslavement. You talked about the story of Ham, but also about examples of slavery within biblical households. And then you made this kind of aside about they differ in kind, and I didn't know what you meant by that.
Yeah, the simplest thing that I meant by that was that American enslavement and the enslavement of the Middle Passage and the traffic in people to the Americas, that was that was based explicitly on a theory of racial superiority, and almost all known instances of enslavement have been related to war or debt. And they have not been permanently justified on a claim of the non-human status of the enslaved persons. So it's a bad analogy to say that Abraham's household included slaves, because Abraham's household also included ground rules about how they're to be treated, when they were to be set free, and they were just not, it just wasn't rationalized on a racialized theory of group superiority and group inferiority. So it was a bad analogy. It was an analogy that didn't suit their cause. Thanks for those good questions. At this point, at least I know you're wearing each other out. It's not that I'm imposing on your time.
Hi, I'm Victoria.
Hi, Victoria.
And your mother's a good friend of mine through music. And I come to you with a question. I'm trying to actually formulate exactly what it is. So let me just say that it was touched on from your story about your friend who was deeply hurt from the song.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I want to talk about is appropriation in terms of music, lyrics, and those sorts of things. I've always loved singing, for example, spirituals.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually wrestling with this a little bit. We had an occasion a few years ago where our opera company did the Mikado, and there were some people who did bring the idea of appropriation up for community discussion and challenged whether we should be doing it. So if you could address
I can.
that.
Thank you, Victoria. I said brightly I can address that, but of course not completely, and I can't provide a formula. But appropriation, of course, is the word we use when a group with dominant cultural privilege takes the artistic achievements of a group that has been disenfranchised and takes them over, appropriates them for its own pleasure and profit. And in my own music-making hobbies, I have loved the blues. And as it happens, the way I came to know about the blues was because white Englishmen discovered the blues of the American South, which was produced by black people living lives of hardship, and loved it and played it. And then I heard the Brits, and I learned the blues from them. We know that in many cases, the white rock and roll bands became fabulously wealthy by playing versions of songs that were written and initially performed by people who remained mired in poverty. And that was because the record labels and the whole symbolic scheme of celebrity and notoriety favored the celebrity of the white bands and allowed them to become stars without proper compensation for the music that they were just lifting and borrowing. That's the worst kind of appropriation, because it means that a culturally dominant group takes the artistic achievement of a subdominant group, uses it for its own benefit and profit without any acknowledgement, except later on there would be a little, guilt-prompted recognition that, Leadbelly, Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, they, made this music that I love so much. And the ticket price for my next concert will be $100, and so on. So that's the worst kind of appropriation. Then there are appropriations of many kinds that are, different degrees of injustice to the original producers. I think that art is beautiful and universal currency. And I think that song is beautiful and universal currency. But I think anybody who sings a song ought to be knowledgeable. I think you have a kind of a responsibility to be cognizant of where the song originated and whose blood made that song possible, whose suffering generated the sorrow that gave rise to melody. And we ought to know our own investments in it. So, the spirituals are exceptionally beautiful music because they come from exceptionally creative people living face to face with the greatest intensity of human experience. And so there's a kind of universal currency in that music. And yet there's also something really unseemly about those of us who, earlier today, I said, we white Christians are more closely identified with the empire, Pilate, than we are with Jesus on the cross. There's something unseemly about us blindly lifting up music that was produced by enslaved populations for their survival and singing it in our comfort. And so, how to reconcile these things? I claim music is a universal currency that we can all share, and I claim that there's something unseemly about a white congregation enriching its spiritual life by the music that was produced by people enslaved by whiteness. And I think the reconciliation is that we dare not sing the music of other people's sorrow without first a proper investigation of our own hearts and souls, without first a proper research into the origins, and without proper acknowledgement in our programs, in our program notes, and in our hearts. And also with a little bit of humility, because I think when we perform that music, we will perform it according to standards that in our communities govern what is beautiful and acceptable. And it will be thrilling and uplifting to people. Last night we heard, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." That was gorgeous. And everyone in that room was better because of it. But that performance was not what that song is originally. Because that song originally is the cry of a person who feels like a motherless child because they're a motherless child. There's nothing metaphoric about that song. So I think there's a certain humility that goes with us, a certain caution, because we can sing to our own standards, and in a way we will always fall short of the authenticity of the communities where that music was birthed. That's all I've got.
Yeah. I appreciate the conversation.
Sing well.
We're trying.
Good.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lynn.
Oh, I
White Minnesota girl, all that. I'm holding two things right now, humility and courage to be with. I'm thinking of, in this church I heard first through Jim, what we find here is comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable in the best form, and love. And I especially feel John Lewis with us today, with you, David, and I found him terribly inspiring, and I'm touching back on you and the hope and the joy and the positivity of stay in this game, because we are here with power and choice. And so I would just love you to speak about John Lewis. For me, he was that. He got up every morning, and no matter what, said out loud, I'm gonna make good trouble. And it's with love, and I'm gonna believe that every person I meet, no matter what their history, is mine and ours to create something beautiful with. And so, John Lewis, to you.
Yeah. Well, it goes without saying, I'm no John Lewis. There's a hero. And a person feels small in front of the legacy of a hero like that. And so, nevertheless, you try to live up to the example. And I can't live up to that. I can't begin to live up to that example. Probably none of you can live up to that example. That's a hero. You pay your respects and honor, and you pay your homage. You can learn from the example, and even though you can't be that hero, you can try and take inspiration from that heroism, and you can say, though I lack the courage and vision, nevertheless, this is what's in me to do. And you can also, Lynn, as you said, he kept hope and a buoyant spirit. And he did what was available to him to do. Once he was elected, that was a triumph because, he marched for the right to vote. The right to vote was acknowledged. He got elected. He served in legislatures that were dominated by people that were blind about whiteness and sought to uphold it. He kept working. He kept legislating. He kept persuading. He kept talking. He kept being a decent man. And that's what we can do. We can't be as heroic as John Lewis, and we can't let that fact block us from doing the things we can do. So we got to take from him that, literally, he took a step, then he took another step. People tried to stop him. He kept walking. And so his steps are bigger and bolder and braver than most of ours. But his example, keep walking. Keep walking. Honey Rose.
Thank you for remembering my name. I'm going to make two quick comments that maybe you'll have a statement for, and then have a deeper question. So the concept that racism in our country simply morphs to the current is really, really helpful and important. And an area that I'm aware of right now would be the growing field of psychedelics and entheogens being used, because it's becoming a white capitalist, white-owned event, and on the backs of all the people of color from around the world that have used these medicines forever. Yeah. So that's a very, very current morph. Yeah. And then the idea, one practical idea that I think is working and can work for anybody as an idea, whenever you're filling out Social Security forms or government forms of any kind, or school forms, county election forms, don't put white. Go ahead and check other, or I would prefer not to say, because the research that grants money to certain areas is very much on where are the whites and who are the whites. So if we just don't say, then they have to appropriate money and do the research in different ways based on something other than how many white people are in that area. Yep. So my other comment, I think it's important for us to talk about the sorrowful heart. And I really appreciate that. Marty, thank you for wanting the great Dr. King to meet your beautiful son who's willing to be touched. I am very, very white. I'm poor, but I'm super educated and have all kinds of privilege as a white person. I now have a grandson who is a village person. He is Black, Indigenous, Mexican, Tarascan, and white. But he looks very dark skin, dark hair, dark everything. And I walk around with my daughter, who is Mexican and Tarascan, and her boyfriend, the baby's dad, who is very, very Black. And I have never in my life experienced having so many people watch me and wonder. Even when I'm just alone with my grandson, people are like, "That's your grandson? What?" And I don't feel that guilt is what gives us a tender heart. And I don't feel that other people's ignorance is what hurts me. I think that as Jesus followers and church people of any kind, and I also have a Buddhist practice, it is more about having such a big, giant heart that is so completely open that I realize that the other people's sadness is also my own sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could say more. I'm also a person who weeps at all things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Thank you for
Well,
your
that's beautiful, and I'm
heart.
not going to add very much to that, because first of all, the news about how, the war on drugs was used to incarcerate black men at an astonishing rate. Now the profit in drugs is being used to enrich white companies. The phrase I have been trying out in my mind is racist translations, because racism it's expedient. It takes new forms when it needs to. It's implacable, and that's why the work is so hard. And then the other thing I'll just react to is that, oh, your grandson. We can love our children and love our grandchildren, and we see our children in the world, and they're God's creatures. They're wonderful, and our hearts go to them, and we love them. And yet so many are living in blighted situations because of whiteness and capitalism. And surely the tenderheartedness that comes from loving our own grandchildren and the grandchildren we can see up close can open our hearts to all the grandchildren, all the little kids. So I love thinking about the love of a grandchild as the source of a tender heart. And I love the thought of you walking with that child wherever you want to go.
Coffee with Marty.
Yeah, okay.
Marty's a good friend of my grandson.
Okay, sounds good. I don't want to be the cop of time, but you were promised an exit by 12, and so let's answer a couple questions, and then we'll make sure you get to go away by then. Hi,
Well,
Connie.
following up on that, I'd like to talk about generosity, and generosity of spirit and generosity of monetary things. And some of us are privileged enough to be able to give money and throw money at things. And I struggle with that. It's not enough for me to just give money. On the other hand, it's not right for me not to give money if I am capable of doing that. But then I wonder too, where is the generosity of spirit that changes people's hearts to say, I understand. I can talk to my family or my friends. I have the courage to say, I am privileged. I should give reparations. We should. How do we change people's hearts to do the right thing, to follow in Jesus' steps, or follow in any kind of justice?
Well, Connie, that's the hard question. As to the money, I think the posture you described is the right one. Personal generosity is good and necessary for us personally. It's good for our own souls to be generous when we can be generous. But it will never do to think that personal generosity substitutes for the community-wide national reparation that needs to happen. We need to be generous with our own wallets, but we need to be lobbying for a corporate, collective, shared generosity at the same time. And then the generosity of heart. I said earlier that I admire a person who remains in a dialogue with family members. We need to have the courage to, gently, affectionately sympathize with why our family members are frightened. It's hard for a rich man to give up wealth, but a rich man cannot get into the kingdom of God because they are caring for their wealth and they are not caring for God. You can have one and not the other. And so it takes love and kindness to wish and hope that people can let go their investment in whiteness and all its rationalizations and excuses. We have to know that they're frightened because they're being asked to give up a toehold of prestige in a world where Elon Musk can buy Twitter out of his pocket, and I'm one paycheck away from the street. I'm frightened, and if I give up the one thing I've got, it's scary. So we need to be generous with our friends, but we need to keep on walking. And I think maybe the main thing we need to say is, we're all going to be better one day when we're free of these things that separate us and instill fears or mistrusts. We're all going to be better. Okay.
Hello,
Hi,
my name
Agnes.
is Agnes, and I've got more, not of a question, but a reflection, because you were talking about your experience with Dr. King when you were small, and your awakening or reflection of race. Well, I had a similar experience. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't have the privilege of meeting Dr. King, but I remember riding the public bus with my mother. And we would sit, together in the bus, and you'd see all the black people walking toward the back of the bus. And I was just maybe 7 or 8 years old at the most. And I would see them laughing and talking and smiling and going to the very back of the bus. In my child's mind, I thought, it must be fun back there. Why would they all go back there and they're smiling and whatever? So I asked my mother, I said, can I go to the back of the bus? And she said, sure. So I said, okay. So I went back there to the seat in the very back that goes across the whole, bus. And 2 men moved over and patted the seat and said, sit here, child. So I sat there and I talked to them a while and everything, and they were so nice. But after a while, a few minutes of complete sadness, I couldn't describe it, just came over me because I realized it's not really that much fun back here. But I couldn't explain with my 7-year-old the sadness. So I went to sit back with my mother and I said, why do they sit back there? She said, was it okay? I said, yes. She said, that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And from then on, I questioned things about the restrooms, the water fountains, and that's all the answer I ever got from them. That's just the way it is. And I hope in my lifetime and in some there won't be any need to question anything. No need at all.
Thank you. I will say that it turns out being white is not fun, because being white means that somewhere in the back of your mind there's a little bit of guilty conscience. And a lot of people try to pretend they don't know that guilty. A lot of people try to deny it's there, and they try to deny they've got any responsibility. A woman in Virginia, in one of the school districts where white parents became militant, said, why is it a problem for me if somebody's granddad was mean to somebody else's granddad? Your head hurts at that kind of denial. So she's working hard to deny the unjust situation that she's in and benefiting from. It's not fun spending your life denying stuff. It messes up the gears of your mind. It's bad to spend your life denying things. And so white people are deprived of a lot of fun because we're working so hard at persuading ourselves that we're okay. And if we would just stop propping up the systems that are unjust, we could relax and have a little more fun. And I think one of the small evidences of this is that, when white people go to black worship and they see that there are other ways you can worship besides the way that I know, they think, wow, that could be really fun. I could just shout. I could stand and sing and dance, and I could listen to praise music. But of course I can't do it because I was raised a different way and I have got different instincts and habits in my heart. It's not fun. And it could be a lot more fun if we could just own the guilt, put it out in public, and dismantle it and move on. There could be a community of peace and justice. There could be, but we'll have to let go of some things. Let go of the wealth of whiteness. Then you can get a camel right through the eye of a needle. You're going to be the last speaker today.
Okay. One of the things that I really appreciated was your sharing your stories about your awakening of this, in answer to Jackie's question. However, as I reflected on most of what you said, you referred only with black and white lenses.
I'm sorry.
And didn't talk very much about brown or Asian or Native American people. And I was wondering if you could share stories of how you became awakened to your position in relation to them.
Yeah. Thank you. I take it you said that to me in kindness and gently. I deserve to be called out for that, because on this day, I was telling a story about the racialized categories of black and white. And I know that those are not the only categories that whiteness has produced, because I know in Texas, on the border between Texas and Mexico, there's constant work with 200 years of legacy to invent some racialized categories. I know throughout this continent, there has been, in effect, genocide of indigenous people. I know that we're witnessing a shocking upsurge of anti-Asian violence and an upsurge in anti-Asian rhetoric. And you are also right to point to the stories, because of course it's the stories of personal encounter that help us to see what we haven't seen before. And it's trite for me to say, well, my Asian friend helped me to see anti-Asian violence. But it's also true, because in conversation with a Japanese American friend of mine, I have come to understand what's going on in our country, especially in the time of the epidemic, which was weaponized by demagogues to foster white supremacy and anti-Asian bias. And it was brown colleagues of my daughter who speak out about the experience of Latinx people in Minneapolis. And of course, the life of indigenous people in the upper Midwest is all around us. And the way they have been deprived of land and subject to scorn is all around us. So I didn't tell those stories today, but those stories are just as real as the one I told. They go together, and whiteness is the common theme. Whiteness is the thing we need to take apart. Thank you. If you haven't already had more than enough, in tomorrow's worship, I will be talking about the war on transgender people.